Okay, having described a universal structure to society, social identity groups, and the interaction amongst social identity groups, what I call structuration, in Volume 1 of this video series, it's time to begin Volume 2, which will deal with Problemation. Whereas structuration established the fundamental social structures that constitutes human social existence, and emphasized change over time, which it emphasizes, of course, the structural dynamics. And these change very slowly. Moving to Problemation, we're focusing on political dynamics, which change relatively rapidly, and they can change at any point in time, quite dramatically. Political dynamics have two basic aspects: rational aspect, or rationality, human rationality, and then the emotive content, human emotional response, as the second, the emotive aspect. And both of these figure very large into political dynamics. In conventional, traditional political science, it's only the first, the rational aspect, that's emphasized, and very rarely does this discussion ever bring in the emotive content of political action. From this point of view, the emphasis is that emotive content is what drives political dynamics or political action. That rationality shaped them and helped define them over time as political action becomes institutionalized. What begins rational action is the emotive content, what pushes it, what not only pushes political action at the individual level, but pushes mobilization at the collective level, and also helps push the social process. And now we're going to talk about a universal, fundamental social process model. That the basic element is time. The social process over time tends to move through a three-step escalatory process. And that's what I'm going to be discussing in this video, the first in the series on Problemation. So let's set up the conceptual space for social process. At the beginning, at the far left, we have cognition at the individual level, and all political action is at the individual level. Can only be ordered, organized, and disciplined at the collective level, but it all begins at the individual level. And the individual goes through a process of understanding his surrounding, his social condition, his individual condition, his circumstances, and I call this cognition. He transfers whatever reception he has in understanding his situation into a thought process. At the other end of the social process is what I call abreaction. I call this abreaction, or I use the term abreaction, because abreaction emphasizes the emotive content of the end of the social process. Abreaction really points or emphasizes the idea that the cognition remains salient until the individual deals what they see as successfully with that particular issue. And as they come to a resolution of that issue, the emotive content of that issue for that individual diminishes or dissipates. And that issue then, having been resolved, enters into the thought process or the cognition process of that individual, now as a rational issue, the emotive content is diminished or even dissipated to the point where it's not recognized as an emotive quality. But it begins the rational, or the emphasis of rationality, or rational decision-making process. But first, when an issue is new, there's a strong emotive content to it. And even over time, even over resolution, emotive content is retained in how individual values that particular issue. The value they place on it, and how they prioritize then that particular issue amongst the plethora of issues that they have to contend with on a daily or regular basis over the course of their existential experience. So we start with cognition. The individual recognizes his surroundings, and anything that's new, anything that they don't understand, anything that they're not prepared to deal with, is recognized as a conflict. It's not necessarily in conflict with anything in particular. It could be just that it's in conflict in that it's new, and the individual doesn't recognize it and hasn't categorized it or placed it within its knowledge base or its existential context. But it recognizes something new. There's a conflict, and it doesn't know how to respond to this particular issue or how to respond successfully. Well, the individual has several options in dealing with a newly perceived conflict. And usually the individual will seek on their own resources, because it's the easiest thing for an individual to do. Goes through what its own experience and its own knowledge base to see if it has some way to deal with this newly recognized conflict. It'll internalize it as much as possible, but if it can't come up with a resolution to this conflict, the conflict will remain, and it will continue to generate an emotive response. And this will motivate the individual to take this issue into the larger social context. The individual will seek out other individuals who have a similar experience or a similar conflict, and try and extend its knowledge base by consulting or referring with other individuals. Are they familiar with this particular conflict? Have they come up with an understanding of this particular issue? Did they come up with a solution or a resolution of this conflict issue? And if they come up with an issue that's not socially resolved, or there's not a collective resolution to this conflict, and a group of individuals now have an interest in resolving this conflict, it's become an issue, a collective issue. And it tends to lend itself or push towards a collective response. And we call this process of organizing individuals, right? The self-actuating aspect, the first recognition that the individual can't resolve this conflict on their own, then that stimulates the self-actuation. The individual seeks to form a social identity group to deal with this issue. If they're successful in identifying other individuals who have an interest, a similar interest in resolving this conflict, then they get into the self-organizing aspect of social organization. And then by organizing, then they are pushing themselves, having organized and overcome the collective action problem. They are then well situated to get into either pushing to come up with a resolution or acting collectively, or the next step, self-correcting. That if they find that it's their own behavior, their response to their environment that's creating this conflict, they can correct their own behavior. If they don't see that this is a self-correction issue, then we have a mobilization issue, and we have a group conflict. And this is where the social identity group becomes the driving force, or the seat of conflict resolution and conflict management. Whereas the first step, the recognition of conflict, exists within the ideational realm of individuals' understanding of their environment or their surroundings, their circumstances. The second aspect, or the second realm of social process, is the associational. They form social groups in order to come up and build their ability, or their capacity to act in concerted or cooperative fashion. And this may involve a conflict with another group that's created this situation, is maintaining this situation as benefiting their group, but it may have externalities that disbenefit another group of individuals. And so you have a mobilization to try and change the terms of the issue to something that's more favorable, a more favorable outcome to the mobilized group. Then if through social mobilization, collective action, the group of individuals, the social identity group that has taken on this interest to try and resolve this conflict, is unsuccessful in negotiating with their circumstances, their environment, with other groups within their environment to try and resolve this conflict, there will be what we usually term an increase in the emotive content. There will be an increase in frustration. If there's an interaction, there can be a sense of injustice in that they feel aggrieved vis-a-vis some other groups that they feel are responsible for creating this conflict or this condition which is making them uncomfortable, or which is limiting their goal-seeking behavior, or creating externalities that they feel that they have to are differentially exposed to. This increases the prioritization of this particular issue, or the resolution of this. That this group feels that if this issue is of high enough value to group members, that they're willing to put more and more effort into the resolution. And being frustrated in this resolution, they're willing to invest more and more effort into resolving this conflict. Of course, they could decide collectively that it's not worth the investment in time and effort to escalate their effort any further, and they may then just accept their circumstances and adapt to this situation and change their own behavior. As I mentioned, the self-correcting aspect of social organization, that they will change their own behavior to help mitigate or minimize the adverse effects of this particular conflict. And they may reach an accommodation then, which would then lead to an abreaction, or a reduction or dissipation of the emotive content, in which case they would no longer feel compelled to continue to seek resolution. But if it is a strong enough issue, deeply felt, they do identify that the source of the conflict may be outside the particular interest group, that there's another group involved, that they're holding responsible, that they think that their behavior should be changed rather than their own, or that they feel that a cooperative solution is not available because either they don't feel that they should compromise, or the other group is not willing to compromise. Then we see an escalation to this third stage in the social process. And here it's labeled violence, but it's really in the instrumental realm now. That instead of talking, reasoning, trying to find a solution that's mutually advantageous, or at least minimizes the negative effects on that particular interest group, they're willing to put more effort into it, and so you get into coercion, that there's still a conflict, that this group is acting either with its environment or interacting with another group, and they start pushing a little bit further, mainly to demonstrate how important this issue is to them by acting out. And they'll act out usually by protesting, demonstrating, signaling in some way the value, just how strongly they feel about this particular issue, and how badly they are seeking a resolution, and how much that they are trying to change the economic incentive structure to get the other social actors to recognize that perhaps it's in their interest to seek a cooperative solution. So they'll start out and with this instrumental realm. And what we found in research is they don't usually, there's individuals, of course, have different proclivities, and that's what the social identity group argues, that there are extremists who will immediately jump to violence. The militants who will immediately jump to some form of force. But the bulk, the majority of this social identity group will continue to pursue lesser coercive strategies, and these usually are petition, protest, trying to change the economic structures to create incentives for cooperation. That over time, of course, this instrumental aspect will tend to escalate. And no matter where this conflict ends up being managed, it will be managed properly when it reaches the point of abreaction. That the emotive content has to be dissipated in order for the social group to turn its impetus for collective action to some other issue. That they've either resolved this through changing their own behavior, they resolved it by some cooperation, some compromise with other groups that are equally interested in this particular issue, or they will push the coercive aspect or the violence aspect to where they've actually overcome the resistance of other groups to their particular solution, or they have themselves been conquered by the interest or the position of another group in which they're in a contentious conflict situation. The problem, of course, is that if violence defines the solution to the conflict issue, the abreaction that we find in these situations is what we often term war weariness. That at least one of the groups in contention will decide collectively that the pursuing this issue is no longer in their interest. The cost is too high. It's costing more than they actually value the situation, or they feel that there is no solution, that their best solution is to stop and get out of the instrumental interaction. In this case, the emotive content is internalized. It's not dissipated. And that's why we see that even though, as Monica Toft has pointed out in her book, that conflicts that are resolved through a forceful outcome, that is one side winning, are more likely to stabilize as a solution We also find, in contradiction to that observation, that conflicts that were resolved through force or violence have a fairly short-term solution, that these issues tend to recur and then go through the same escalatory process. And so we see violence recurring periodically or on a cyclical basis. And we see this use of instrumental capacity in solving a conflict amongst individuals organized into social groups. We see this as really being institutionalized as unequal relationship, and even a discriminatory relationship. And the success of instrumental means in resolving conflict then become internalized into a culture of violence, that the injustice becomes embedded, and it's what Galton would call structural violence. It's not being acted out, but it's embedded within the culture, and then tends to recur as groups and individuals within these groups will reform into new groups at a later point in time after this effect of this experience of the violence and the ill effects of the violence washes out of the population. We get a new generation that's experiencing the same conflict issue. They don't have this dampening effect of the experience of coercion and violence or being overwhelmed by force, that they take this issue up and they restart this political social process of trying to resolve this particular issue. So in a complex scheme, as we are talking about now with globalization, we have hundreds, thousands, millions, billions of social processes going on continually. As we have a social learning component, that's what enables complexity, that's what enables development, that conflicts are resolved. And as conflicts actually are resolved inclusively, meaning that no subset of social individuals are finding themselves in an asymmetric relationship as far as the distribution of costs and benefits, that these are institutionalized into the ideational realm and the associational realm as either laws, rules, or customs by which individuals act in certain ways to minimize the conflict that they're going to experience on a daily basis, or they're dealt with institutionally so that we have individuals who are acting in regulated and regular patterns of behavior within institutional structures that tend to cater to particular interests, and those organizations then proliferate as the basis of pluralism, which is, of course, what enables complexity. So that when we look at the social learning process of stable social groupings, identity groups in a politically relevant context, that over time they accumulate a lot of rules and regulations, the rule of law, which guides their behavior, most of which is in culture and custom. And so we find ourselves behaving in certain ways. We don't even question these things. We're socialized into behaving in these ways. And the socialization process is really teaching us how to act in ways that minimize our experience of conflict in our environment, under our circumstances. And so we see in this particular diagram that's now colored that most of individual activity in the social context tends to aggregate at near the point of cognition, that as we teach individuals and they learn how to interact with their environment, most everything is dealt at the point of cognition. That you wake up and you have a conflict, you don't have anything in the house to eat, you immediately recognize the solution to that problem and you fix it without mobilizing, without escalating to an instrumental interaction. You have ways and means of dealing with these everyday issues. And as we learn more and more everyday issues can be handled at the point of cognition, this is what enables complexity. That we learn how to interact successfully in our social context, in our social environment, without experiencing conflict. And so the conflicts that tend to arise as we develop the social identity group that, of course, is relevant to politically as it grows over time, that these conflicts that tend to arise are something new, and they tend to be recognized as a crisis often. Low-level conflicts, something we weren't aware of. As we expand our range of activity, we'll experience new situations that we're not familiar with, and of course we can seek out then institutional solutions, and these will then handle most of these new situations as individuals expand their scope of behavior or their interests. And so this is what differentiates autocratic authority from democratic authority at the fundamental level. That autocratic authority resists change and tries, therefore, to dampen mobilization, because mobilization occurs in the social context as new issues come up and individuals are adversely affected and they want to change the status quo. Of course, autocracy resists changes in the status quo, so they actively work to dampen mobilization and stop the organization of new interest groups. Whereas democracy embraces mobilization. They recognize that as new issues come up, it's very important to gauge in order for the system to gauge the strength and the full meaning of that particular conflict, to have individuals mobilize and act out in non-threatening ways, to protest, to demonstrate, so that they can gauge just exactly how important this issue is, and therefore have an incentive to find new solutions, to innovate. And so democracy encourages mobilization as its main source of innovation. And also it has a fringe benefit of having issues come up, and it spurs entrepreneurialism. As individuals discover new things and they then mobilize to create products that then can be used to pacify or satisfy newly emerging interests. So democracy, therefore, by embracing mobilization, but also in embracing mobilization, has to have institutional basis that allows for change. It can then incorporate more interests, find more innovative solutions, stimulate more entrepreneurial activity, and therefore become a much more productive system. And in doing this, of course, it not only engages the self-corrective factor in that it's changing in order to minimize conflict or friction amongst social interest groups, and so it also increases the societal systems, and especially the state's capacity to respond to new conflicts and emerging issues that come about due to changing circumstances, which are advanced function of the development process. So, over time, the play out of the social process matches up with the social learning process. That as conflict issues come up and are resolved, goes into the body of knowledge that's accumulated by the societal system. Of course, can be shared between societal systems as part of the social learning process. But the important thing is that the self-regulating and the self-correcting functions of the state and the societal system, which is led by the state, increasingly puts this social learning, these resolutions to conflicts, these regulations that help minimize the day-to-day, everyday conflicts that individuals will encounter, to the left side of this social process model, as close to cognition as possible, so that the individual has a body of knowledge which is codified, institutionalized, not only in law but also in custom. And so through the social learning and socialization process, the individual learns best practices and expectations on how not only to regulate themselves but also to correct their own behavior in order to maintain voluntary compliance. That is, to minimize the amount of time, effort, and energy the individual has to expend in order to get everyday tasks completed. This is, of course, a social benefit to the individual, and so there's a symbiosis of voluntary compliance and regulation and correction of the societal system. This also leads to, obviously, to good governance, but increases the amount of complexity as development proceeds and social learning happens and socialization incorporates knowledge into guiding behavior. We see an increase in the amount of complexity that can be dealt with by individuals in social situations, and so we see increasing complexity. What this does is, as I mentioned, reduces the burden on the individual, reduces the burden on the societal systems and the state in maintaining conflict management function. And if it's equally employed and equally complied with by different social identity groups, it also aids in societal integration over time. Okay, in conclusion, Volume 2 focuses on problemation. And so one of the themes of Volume 2 will be to identify the problems of political dynamics. The problem identified in this video is as follows. As instrumental strategies are far more likely to characterize conflict interactions between social identity groups at lower levels of societal system development, and because the state tends to enjoy greater relative instrumental capacity vis-a-vis non-state constituent groups, instrumental strategies are more likely to both define such contentious interactions and favor state interests, thereby defining conflict outcomes to the benefit of political elite and their special interests at lower levels of development. Instrumental action by state authorities, because it can be perceived as being crucial to the successful solution of conflict interactions, will tend to become embedded and even entrenched in the political culture of the state and imprinted on the national culture. Political institutions constructed by victorious political elites, then, will contain learned practices and strategies that are perceived as useful and which have been successful at previous levels of development. Political elites and their successors will tend to favor instrumental responses to future provocations, even though the use of instrumental behaviors increasingly complicate the development process and are counterproductive to the state's core functions of conflict management and societal integration, thereby dampening, distorting, and slowing the general development process.